There has never been a more important time to move in a vegan direction. Whether you're ready to start, restart, or re-energize your vegan or plant-based practice, this podcast is for you. I'm Michelle Olander, life coach, vegan, ADHD matriarch, travel lover, and smoothie loather. And I know that it's the details that get in the way of your vegan journey. But I like to believe that the obstacle is always the way. So every week we meet here where I translate the tools of life coaching and Stoic philosophy. I bring you actionable tips, some laughs, interesting guests, and vegan ideas for everyone at any age. All to help you veg your best. Episode 214, Veganic Gardening with Meg Kelly. Welcome back to Veg Your Best today, my Veg Your Bestie. We're digging in, if you will, digging into the world of veganic gardening with our guest, Meg Kelly. Meg is I don't know how to say it differently. She's a passionate advocate for organic and vegan agriculture, and she's the co-founder of the Veganic Agriculture Network and creator of the Learn Veganic Gardening course. Meg has traveled all across North America to visit and learn from veganic farms, and you will hear for yourself the wealth of knowledge and experience she brings to our conversation today, as well as her very down-to-earth, clear, and really delightful delivery style. In this episode, we're going to explore what veganic gardening actually is and how it differs from traditional organic methods, and why it's a practice for those, like many of us, who are committed to a plant-based and vegan practice. Meg's going to share some practical tips for starting your own veganic garden, or at least bringing in veganic techniques to it. And she'll tell you how to make compost without animal products and use readily available plant materials as fertilizers. And even if you are not a gardener, why should you care about this episode? Because you're a consumer and you're a citizen. And I really think this is information you're going to want. Now, if you are a gardener, this episode's packed with valuable insights, so let's not waste another minute. Meg Kelly, veganic gardening expert. Welcome to Veg Your Best podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. I'm so glad you're here. And maybe some people are thinking, October, is that the veganic gardening season? But I think you're going to tell us that there are plenty of things for us to do in October to be veganic gardeners.
Absolutely. Actually, the fall is one of the best times that you can start preparing a garden, because there's certain things, if we start putting them in place in the fall, it's going to be that much easier for us to garden when the springtime comes around.
You know, I heard you talking to someone else, and you said that the first thing you would advise any gardener to do is start their compost pile.
Absolutely. Because when it comes to veganic gardening, which is where we want to use entirely plant-based materials to fertilize our garden, one of the easiest ways we can do that is by making our own compost at home. And if you start making compost now, it's going to be ready that much sooner when you need it.
So that's not the fun answer we all want. We all want to run to a beautiful vegan garden center and buy all kinds of cool plants and ornamentals. But I think you're giving us some wise advice. So tell me, before we get into some specifics, what brought you to this place in your professional life as a veganic gardener?
Yeah, absolutely. So I became vegan a bit over 20 years ago, and a few years into it, I got curious about growing my own food. And that's when I realized that a lot of plants are fertilized using animal products. So things like blood meal, bone meal, feather meal, fish emulsion, manure from animal farms. And I realized that as a vegan, that was definitely not the way that I wanted to fertilize my fruits and vegetables. So back in 2008, I co-founded the Veganic Agriculture Network, which is an organization that promotes how we can grow our food using entirely vegan techniques, both on the farm scale and garden scale. And then I gardened for about 15 years using veganic techniques. And in 2021, I started teaching a veganic gardening course called Learn Veganic so that other people can learn how to garden too. So I've really, really enjoyed my own journey of learning how to garden. And it's something that brings us a lot of joy to bring to other people too, so that they can do their own gardens in a way that aligns with their ethics.
So, Meg, this is such a constant thing I see among people moving in adult life towards a vegan practice. It opens up a bunch of areas, places, concepts they've never, ever, ever considered, that they never thought they'd be involved in. Were you involved in food production or agriculture before you became vegan?
No, we had a little garden, a little veggie garden when I was growing up that my dad used to have. And so I'd occasionally help in the veggie garden a bit. But it was really when I was in my mid-20s that I started kind of questioning, where does my food come from? I was getting more interested in being more self-sufficient, more self-reliant, doing some reskilling so that I could learn some of these vital skills that we should all have. And so it was really at that time that I started to uh, just get interested in growing my own food, that I realized that yes, it does open up this whole new world, not only this whole new world in terms of discovering plants and how to grow them, but also discovering that there's one more thing in our life that we need to try to veganize.
Yeah. And it's not, I've also heard you talk about this. It's not to put another piece of pressure on each individual to be vegan in one way or to be plant-based in one way. But I do think what you're saying is it does open you up when you know more. You are interested in making different distinctions because you're part of a process that how food gets to us is a remarkable process. And I'm a medieval historian by training, and the roads, the rivers, the way our cities developed in the West anyway, and I'm guessing in the East as well, it's around food
Hmm.
distribution. It's around food growing and distributing. So it's so part of our culture. And I think it's so fun that many of us are just shut down until we move in a direction like plant-based or vegan to know how it gets there. So so this opened up a whole world for you. It opened up a whole new professional life for you. And so also I want everyone to know you're in Canada. You're not in a area which has an enormous growing season like mid-central California.
Yeah, we're up in Canada. We have a very short growing season. We can get frosts in early June. We can get frosts in early to mid-September. So, even things like tomato plants here, we can grow them, but it's a little bit limited. We have a lot of green tomatoes on our plants still when the frosts come. We do, however, have a lot of sunshine here in the summer. We also have quite a bit of rain most years. And so our season is short, but when it's happening, it's a good season to work with for sure.
Well, that's good to know. They have their challenges for the temperature in that latitude. So you are in Eastern Canada. You are in Quebec right now. You said you grew up in Ontario. We're very pro Canada here at Veg Your Best. Have you traveled much in the US with your work as a veganic gardener?
So back around 2008, 2009, 2010, I did a tour of the US to visit veganic farms and to interview the farmers. So I visited veganic farms in New York State, down in California, in Arizona. So it was really interesting to see how people were putting veganic techniques into action in different climates.
And what about the UK? Have you been to the UK for any of their? Because I know they have some of the longer veganic agricultural groups. No?
Yeah, absolutely. The UK has a group called the Vegan Organic Network that was founded in 1996. They've been doing some absolutely amazing work. And I haven't been there personally to visit veganic farms, but Stefan Groslo, who co-founded the Veganic Agriculture Network with me, when he was first learning about veganics back in the early 2000s, he went to Europe for about 8 months and went around to veganic farms in England and in Germany and Austria to learn more about veganic practices. So he ended up bringing a lot of that knowledge back to North America.
Wow. So it's not just a you thing. This is a global issue. It's the problems that have brought it about are global, and some of these solutions are global. So you are part of a part of a an awakening.
Yeah, and it's an awakening that I would love to see take on a lot more growth. I think when we look at the vegan movement and how far it's come in recent years, and the organic movement and how far that has come in recent years, I think there's a lot of potential for the vegan organic movement or the veganic movement to grow significantly. And so right now, there's a small number of us who are getting the word out, and we're very excited to bring it to other people. But we'd also like to get more and more people involved, both as farmers, as gardeners, as consumers who are asking for veganic food, people who are asking local farmers if they'd be willing to farm veganically. There's a lot that can be done to grow this movement for sure.
So let's start with some definitions then. I remember as a young mom buying organic and tiny little section of the supermarket with some not very fresh looking things for 3 or 4 times the price. That has changed a lot in the last 30 years or so. Tell me, what's the difference between organic and vegan organic?
Okay, so with organic, organic does a lot of things right. Organic does a lot of wonderful things like taking care of the soil better, making sure that there is our spaces for wildlife, not using any chemical fertilizers or chemical pesticides. So all of those are wonderful things. But basically with organic, the fertilizers can be of vegetable, animal, or mineral origin. And a lot of organic fertilizers that are used are unfortunately animal-based fertilizers. And they're not even necessarily from organic agriculture. There's some loopholes here and there. It depends on which country, what type of loopholes there are. But basically, there can be things like slaughterhouse byproducts, like the blood that's dried down into blood meal or bones that are kind of pulverized into bone meal. Those can be from standard factory farms and then used as fertilizer, oftentimes in organic agriculture. What we do with veganic is we go an extra step and say, hey, let's cut out all of these animal-based fertilizers and let's use entirely plant-based fertilizers or minerals. Sometimes we'll use a little bit of rock powder or something like that in veganic too. We try to minimize the amount of rock powder that we use just because mining has its own environmental impacts. So we concentrate on what we can do with plants directly as a fertilizer. So basically, veganic is just taking organic and going that one extra step and veganizing it. And by doing so, there's a lot of wonderful advantages. One of them is that we really cut down on the risk of things like E. coli contamination and salmonella contamination. We're also making it so that we're no longer supporting factory farms financially because when people buy blood meal and bone meal and feather meal, obviously this is still supporting financially animal agriculture. And so it's a way that we can basically work toward creating an entirely plant-based food system that doesn't rely on animal agriculture. And veganic also uses a lot less land because when we think about having something like manure as a fertilizer, well, we need to realize that there was a huge amount of land that was needed in order to create that manure, in order to kind of support that animal agriculture system. When we cut animal agriculture out of the equation, ultimately we're using um, far less surface area in order to grow our food.
So that's another area that didn't even occur to me, the amount of land, the surface area. That's a poser. So it's similar then to the idea when you go vegan and people say, where do you get your protein from? We don't get our protein specifically from a cow. The cow, we're getting it passed through a cow or a pig or a chicken. The components that go into fertilizer or into amendments to the soil are basically just the, what is it, nitrogen, potassium, nitrogen, is it phosphorus?
Yeah, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, those are the three big ones. And then there's other things like calcium and boron. Yeah, and as you're mentioning, yeah, when we look at things like with our diet, where do we get our protein? Where do we get our calcium? And people associate that with meat and milk, but really that protein and that calcium came directly from the plants. Well, it's the same thing when we talk about fertilizer. So sometimes people say, well, manure is high in nitrogen or manure is high in phosphorus. Well, a cow or a pig or a chicken, simply ate some plant foods that contained nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium and then pooed it out. They didn't create any of those elements. They just digested it. And actually, there's less in the manure than there was in the original plant substance. So if we take the original plant, we're actually using the whole plant. And the wonderful thing is that we have so many organisms that are naturally living in the soil who can break things down. So there's no need to have animal agriculture in order to take plant materials and break them down into something that plants can use. If we create a compost pile, there's going to be worms who are going to show up. There's going to be fungi. There's going to be bacteria that are naturally occurring, and they're going to break it down in a very similar way to what would happen, for example, in a cow's digestive system. But all of the original nutrients came from plants. So there's no reason to think that we need animal agriculture in order to fertilize our plants.
So we want to go to the store and fix it, though. We want to go to the store and buy a bag that has those three numbers on our fertilizer. So, but if we take a step back, we can learn some practices in terms of our soil itself, keeping the soil itself, which is probably good for more than just the plants we're growing in that soil.
Yeah, absolutely. Taking care of our soil is one of the best things that we can do because the soil really is nature's digestive system. When we think about what's going to happen out in a forest or out in a field, for example, there's going to be plants that are going to die back in the fall, for example, and then all of the soil organisms are going to break that down. And that's really the way that fertility is maintained in natural systems. In natural systems, you don't have anyone going in and dumping hundreds of pounds of manure in one place all in one go. Most natural systems are pretty much self-fertile. And when we talk about a garden, we do want to be boosting it a little bit more than you would with something like a forest or a natural field, because in a garden, we are trying to get more out of it. We are trying to kind of maximize our harvest. So it does make sense in settings like this to boost a little bit. But the more that we work with the soil, the more our gardens will become self-fertile and the less we need to add other things in order to have thriving plants. So some things that we can do to help the soil, one thing is to disturb the soil as little as possible. So, oftentimes with gardening, we have that idea that you get in there with a pitchfork every single year and you turn everything over. And sometimes people are doing that to get rid of weeds and things like that. But the interesting thing is, when you have bare soil, what nature does is it says, oh, we need to cover this soil as quickly as possible. And there are plants like dandelions that are really, really good at covering bare soil. That's what they're adapted to do. So when we make our soil bare, we're actually more likely to get more weeds. Whereas if we have soil that we disturb less and we have a mulch on it, and mulch is basically just anything we put to cover the soil. So if you put some leaves on top of your soil, that's a mulch. Or if you put some straw on your soil just to cover the surface of it, that's a mulch. And that will actually help reduce weeds without necessarily disturbing the soil. So I sometimes dig my soil. If I'm creating a new garden, I might dig my soil. There are ways that we've created gardens without digging our soil at all, not even once. But, sometimes I will dig my soil a little bit for specific reasons, like to get some potatoes out and things like that. But as a whole, I try to disturb my soil as little as possible. And in doing so, again, we can kind of create these self-fertilizing systems where we let nature do a lot of the work for us.
So, veganic gardening is a holistic approach to gardening. It is not simply what fertilizers you use or what plants you choose. It's as detailed as just, or not detailed. It's as basic actually as just whether you dig a lot or you dig less or you layer things in the soil.
Yeah, and I mean, one thing I will emphasize is that there are a ton of different ways to do veganic gardening. Somebody can, for example, garden veganically with a container garden on their balcony, or they can garden veganically, in half an acre in a huge backyard. And there are a ton of different ways to fertilize. There are ways that you can grow your own fertilizers. There are fertilizers that you can buy in. Some people dig their gardens, some people don't. And so there are a ton of different ways to do it, and there's not necessarily a right way or a wrong way. We definitely just want to focus on the idea of being gentle with the earth and doing things in a totally plant-based way. But yeah, we do have that tendency in veganic in ways that we can to approach it in a holistic way, where we're caring for the soil and also caring for the surrounding ecology, having certain areas that we leave as habitat for wildlife and trying to put some perennial plants in like berry bushes and fruit trees that might in and of themselves provide us with food and also provide habitat, for birds. So that's, the direction that we can go in. We oftentimes start with just learning how to grow our first lettuce plants and tomato plants. Sometimes we start in the most simple place. But as we get more experience, we can start putting in some more complex elements so that we can have something that's almost like its own little ecosystem that also provides us with food.
I am in love with my ruby-throated hummingbirds, which have just left for the season. There may be a straggler that goes by migrating from up by you that's moving slowly, but I think they're all gone in my area. And we do try to create. They love the tall cannas that we've been growing that are bright red and orange, and so it is something that I think no matter where you are, even if you don't have a full garden, you can do something to kind of um, invite nature to be in your yard, whether it's the bees, whether it's the birds, whether it's some wildflowers, whether it's just that rough area in the side of your garden that you don't make perfectly neat and tidy so that some animals can overwinter in there. So it is October, and I know you have a class about being about how to incorporate veganic gardening wherever you are in your garden. Um, what does October mean? October and November in the northeast of North America. What does that mean for a veganic gardener?
So one thing it means is that there are a lot of materials available that we can collect. So one of the best materials we can use in veganic gardening is autumn leaves. So for those of us who live in climates where we've got all these maple leaves falling and birch leaves falling, and from all sorts of other trees too, we can collect those leaves. Leaves are amazing because basically what trees do is they have these root systems that go down really, really deep and they're in contact with little bits of phosphorus, little bits of calcium, little bits of potassium that are in the rock way under our feet, and they're bringing that up into the tree. And part of that goes into the leaves. So basically, when the leaves fall, they are, they contain minerals that were mined locally in a way that's completely ecological, completely ethical. And yet people oftentimes don't see those leaves as a resource. They see them as a waste product that they want to get rid of. I'm sure in many of our neighborhoods, we have neighbors who are just tossing out bags and bags and bags of leaves. So we can actually collect those. Um, I recommend collecting leaves during the daytime when there's good visibility so you can kind of see which bags look cleaner than others that don't have other things mixed in with them. And if ever you have a neighbor who shreds their leaves, that can, be even better because they break down a little bit faster. But basically, if you collect a whole bunch of leaves, you can put them um, in a pile to decompose on their own. As long as they're moist, they'll decompose over the course of about 2 years and create something that's very similar to soil, which is much faster than how soil is generated out in nature. So 2 years is not that long to wait in order to get a wonderful material. And you can also use leaves in your compost. So if you have 1 part food scraps from your kitchen with 2 parts autumn leaves and mix them together, that will break down over the course of a few months or a year and create a wonderful compost that you can use in your garden. Another way that you can use leaves is, let's just say you have a patch of land and you think, I'd really like to put a garden in there maybe next year. What you could do now is collect a whole bunch of leaves, make sure that they're moist so that they don't blow away, and you could put those maybe a foot thick on the area where you want to have a garden next year and just let it sit there for the next 8 months. And that's going to help kill off the grass that's underneath so that afterward it's going to be easier for you to plant into. So there's a lot of things like that we can do. There's another technique that's really cool called lasagna gardening. That's a technique where you can basically pile up alternating layers of leaves with some food scraps. You can throw some straw in there too if you have some, or some hay, some more food scraps. You can get some alfalfa pellets in there. But basically, we just want to have alternating layers of things that are more nutrient rich, like food scraps and alfalfa, and things that are more carbon rich, like leaves or straw. And if you pile that about 3 feet high and just leave it there for several months over the winter, it's going to start breaking down, almost like a compost pile that you could plant into next spring. So when next spring comes around, you might have to top that up with a few inches of soil so that you've just got a few inches of soil that you can plant into with the young roots. But afterward, the roots are going to go down into that decomposing pile of leaves and food scraps that you have. And again, it's essentially similar to planting into a compost pile. And there are plants like cucumbers and squash in particular, and melons that really, really like young compost as their environment to grow in. So creating a lasagna garden like that now and then planting into it, next spring with squash or cucumbers could be a wonderful combo. So it's actually a little bit tougher sometimes in the springtime because we say, I'd like to garden right now, but whoops, I should have collected all these materials 6 months ago. That would have been convenient. And it can be in the springtime, it's a little bit more of a situation where you have to start looking around like, what can I get at garden centers? And at garden centers, it's a bit tougher because most things aren't vegan. You will find some things that are vegan, like alfalfa meal or soybean meal. You might not find them at your local garden center, but you can find them online. But right now in the fall, there's just such an amazing abundance of resources, which again, most people are throwing out as trash. And we can just reclaim that and reuse it and get our garden started on the right foot.
I love that visual of those beautiful, majestic trees mining the micronutrients of our soil through their roots and bringing them to our leaves that we kind of look at as a nuisance, especially in about 6 weeks when they really are thick and fast every single day on the ground. What a great idea. So that is a beautiful thing that we could think about right now as if we're thinking about gardening, now is the time to maybe think of a section of our yard or to collect, even if we had a container, could we do a small amount in a barrel or something like that on a patio?
Yeah, you can. One thing I would make sure of is that there's at least some oxygen getting in there.
Hmm.
If you with leaves, if you only have leaves, they can actually break down pretty much in the absence of oxygen, and they'll do fine with that. So you actually, if you'd like, you can actually take leaves and put them moist, slightly moist into garbage bags and just put a few little holes in it for a little bit of aeration. But even if there's not that much, it's okay. When we look at something where we're actually adding food scraps and we've got something that's more like a compost pile where we have a combo of leaves and food scraps, in that case, we definitely want a lot of oxygen in the process, because otherwise it's going to go moldy and it's going to be a little bit funky and it's not going to be
Yeah.
a regular composting process. So if you are composting with food scraps and leaves, I would make sure that there's some level of aeration. Um, that said, there's a lot of plastic compost bins out there where it's mostly closed off and it just has a few aeration holes in it. So it doesn't need to be completely open air. It can be largely closed off, but it still needs some level of aeration. Um, one thing I'm going to say too, for anyone who is interested in doing a little bit of woodworking, but you're not very good at it yet, I have to say that making a compost bin is the best woodworking project for beginners because if all of your angles are a bit wonky and if all of your boards don't quite line up, it doesn't matter. It just looks kind of rustic. So I've made my own compost bins before, oftentimes out of reclaimed wood. It was reclaimed wood that I knew didn't have any chemicals on it, so you do have to be a little bit careful with that. But even for someone who's not particularly good at woodworking, I found it was a lovely weekend project, and now I've got compost bins that I've been using for years that are sturdy. I'll just mention too, for anybody who is in an area where you might have problems with rats or mice, because I know some neighborhoods that's not an issue, some neighborhoods it might be a bigger issue. Um, if you just have leaves in general, that's not a problem. Rats and mice will typically not be attracted to piles of leaves if they're moist. If it's a pile of dry leaves, maybe, then it might seem like a habitat. But if you have a bunch of food scraps, occasionally it might attract some animals. So if you have, for example, a wooden compost bin, you can line it with wire mesh on the bottom and the sides, and that will really and quite fine wire mesh so that a worm could get through, but other critters can't. And there's also compost bins that are uh, basically tumbler composts, and they're actually kind of on little legs and they're off the ground, and they're actually designed so that you can turn a handle and turn your compost pile that way. But the thing that's really cool about them is if someone's in an area where they might be concerned, about, rats coming into their compost bin, that's a way just to get the whole thing off the ground. There's a little trap door that you can shut, and it's quite everything's quite closed off. But tumbler composts are also cool if somebody might be composting somewhere like a parking lot or on, a concrete walkway, or maybe even up on a balcony. So there are ways that you can compost even if you don't have kind of direct access to the soil.
And I actually have a couple tumbler ones, and I have a love-hate relationship with them because they fill up pretty quickly. But that you can that you can drain off the fluid for the compost tea,
Yeah.
or if you call it, though I think you have to really dilute it. I find it's very intense.
Yeah, so compost bins will sometimes create a bit of a liquid. And so it's a very nutrient-rich liquid. So as you mentioned, yeah, we need to kind of water it down if we want to feed it to our plants. And I do want to give a shout out to one of my friends, Marco, who he actually created a compost system for balconies.
Oh,
And it's basically having a plastic bucket that you cut the bottom off of, and then you pop that inside of a larger flower pot. And then between the kind of the bucket and the flower pot, there's a ring. You fill it with dirt and grow a few little plants there, maybe a little sprig of oregano and a little sprig of rosemary and things like that, and then compost in the inside bucket. And so with the balcony composter, the thing that's kind of cool about it is that if it does give off any liquid, that liquid kind of gets sopped up by the plants around it that use it automatically as fertilizer. So yeah, there's some really, really cool techniques that can make it possible for people to garden and compost on their balcony.
so Meg, where would we go to learn all these resources and these ideas that you have? Give us a sense of if you're a homeowner or a apartment dweller, or you have a yard, like where would we go if we have a personal interest in gardening for our own small selves? And then what would we do if we have larger ambitions to support bigger initiatives?
Okay, awesome. So I was personally in a very lucky situation, which is when I wanted to learn how to garden. My best friend was a veganic gardener, and so he taught me, and I had a mentor, and that was a really wonderful experience. And so we decided we wanted to try to bring a similar experience to other people. So we created the Learn Veganic Gardening course because we found that most gardening resources out there are just going to tell people to use eggshells, use bone meal, all of those things. And as a vegan, it becomes really difficult to navigate all of these things, just looking for that tiny little bit of vegan advice amongst, all of these animal products. So we have a 7-week gardening course that we teach in February and March that people can learn about more at learnveganic.com. Also, we have a really wonderful resource that you can get for free. And it's a guide to 20 veganic materials for your plant-based garden. Because as I mentioned earlier, there are so many ways that you can fertilize veganically. Sometimes we only think of one or two, like I've mentioned today, compost and alfalfa, but there are so many other ways that go beyond that. So this is the guide personally. I wish I had had when I started gardening, and so we created it so that people can have it for free. So that's available at learnveganic.com/materials. And one thing that's super, super, super exciting that I'd like to invite everybody to is this November 8th to 10th. We're running our second annual Veganic Summit. This is free to join. There's also an option for a paid upgrade if people want even more resources and experiences. But the main part of the summit, which is about 12 or 15 different talks, is free to join. And that's a place where you'll learn I'm going to go into more detail about how to compost more than I was able to today, but we're also going to learn from people who are have self-sufficiency projects to grow almost all of their own food, and people who are commercial farmers on a very small amount of land, and people who are commercial farmers on larger amounts of land who are growing things like uh, spelt in order to make their own pasta at their farm and things like that. So that's really the place to be. That's the place that not only will you have an introduction to veganic growing, but you're also going to meet some of the leading farmers and gardeners in the world who are coming together to share their expertise with you. And it's also a wonderful place to connect with the veganic community because I kind of say that being veganic now is kind of like being vegan in the 1970s where, things were kind of spread out. People didn't necessarily know other vegans, and it can be similar today with veganic gardening. We can feel kind of isolated and like it's harder to connect with people. So in both the Learn Veganic course and in the Veganic Summit, one thing that we find is both really important in both of those contexts is to bring people together so that people can, get advice from other people in similar situations and also just connect with a community. So if you'd like to join us for the Veganic Summit, you can go to veganicsummit.com to get your free ticket. And we're really, really looking forward to sharing this with everybody. This is an area of veganism that is not too common, and it can be difficult to learn about it in other contexts. So that's why we think it's so important to create these experiences for people where they can get introduced to this and start putting the techniques into action themselves.
I think that's marvelous, and this is the perfect time. So if you're listening to this when this podcast comes out in early mid October, this is exactly the right time to sign up for at Veganic Summit, veganicsummit.com. And there's a free ticket. There's also a paid extension if you're interested in more detail. Correct?
Yeah, so there's a paid version that has Q&As with some leading farmers,
Oh, interesting.
and a bunch of guides too. So there's, and there's the Veganic Growers Handbook as part of it, which is a book that's more than 400 pages about veganic gardening and farming. So there's a lot of bonuses with the paid upgrade. But even joining us with the free ticket, there's so much to learn. So we encourage everybody to join who's interested.
That's marvelous. I'm excited about this because, as you're talking about how it used to be being vegan, how it used to be buying organic, still we can notice ourselves being shut down by certain people when we show some enthusiasm going, yeah, okay, well, that just can't be done on a big scale. That can't be done for most people. That's fine for you. You have a nice life. You have an expendable income of some sort, but that's not realistic. But none of these things have been realistic at first. And they have had, now there's gardens in China that are shipping organic food to the United States. So that's another question about how sustainable that is. But it is certainly something people have shown that the market wants and that people can create. So I love the idea of educating ourselves a little more so we can ask better questions and maybe be prepared when someone says, yeah, well, that's not realistic.
Absolutely. And I think, there are a lot of myths around this in the same way that there's a lot of myths around, where do you get your protein? Where do you get your calcium? We're going to encounter the same types of questions when it comes to veganic. And so, a lot of what we need to start with is some of this myth busting. And one of the ways to do that is to show some of these farmers who have been farming this way for 20 years very successfully and who have developed some wonderful techniques to show that, yes, indeed, it is possible. And it's possible in a lot of different climates with a lot of different soil conditions. One of the farmers who's coming to talk at the summit, his name's Ian Tolhurst, and he has been doing this for nearly 50 years now. And his land is actually very poor quality land. It's actually very poorly rated agricultural land with a lot of rocks in it. And he has managed to really improve the quality of his soil without really importing any fertilizers. He's just growing his own fertilizers right in the field by growing high nutrient plants that he ends up feeding back to the soil. And so, yeah, just having these examples of people who have been doing it and doing it successfully, that's one of the most important things. So that way, we can begin to get other people interested in converting over their farms or starting their own farms.
So it's something we could invite our local farmer or our local skeptical farmer to the free version and give them that opportunity to even
ask their own questions, or maybe just tune in to see what they could learn that they could slowly incorporate, even if they're not ready to completely change overnight. And we can also, as consumers, remind the world that there are people who do want to pay for products that are more sustainably, more kindly produced.
Absolutely. And I think, we've seen that people are very interested in buying organic food. And I think a lot of the times people don't even realize some of the things that are in our organic food. And I think that for many of us, veganic food really is what we want. And we're choosing organic because that's the closest thing we can find on our grocery store shelves right now. But I'm sure for many of us, if we had veganic food available, we'd be willing to go farther to seek it out. We'd be willing to pay a little bit more to support a local veganic farmer. So I'd love to see a future where this becomes more available and more accessible for people.
Meg Kelly, thank you so much for joining us. We're going to have all the links in the episode notes. Also over on my Veg Your Best Instagram page, we will be reminding people how to get in touch with you. But to get a free ticket for the summit, Veganic Summit, it's simple, veganicsummit.com, right?
Exactly. It's easy to go to and it's easy to sign up. It just takes a minute, and we're really looking forward to seeing people there.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for joining with us, and thank you for your flexibility this week in terms of our meeting. You made an extra effort for me, and I very much appreciate it. Thank you on behalf of all the Veg Your Best listeners.
Thank you for having me.
So, what did you think of Meg Kelly? From the importance of fall preparation to that magical image of trees mining the earth and offering us their autumn leaves? My gosh, wasn't that beautiful? What are you going to put on your fall list? Some composting, some lasagna gardening? Are you going to be looking to use some readily available plant materials as fertilizers? That's something, even if you're not committed to the full extent of veganic gardening, you can bring some extra awareness to it. And I'm very excited about the upcoming Veganic Summit from November 8th to 10th, coming right up. Registration's now open. I think this is really a fantastic opportunity to learn more about this growing issue, this sustainable and ethical approach to growing food. And in a political season where so many of our decisions are, well, they're very removed from our homes and our shopping baskets, paying a little increased attention to the way we garden and the produce we ask for, that's something most of us can do a little bit more of. So, if you're interested in diving deeper into veganic gardening, don't forget to check out Meg's Learn Veganic gardening course. And there's a free guide to veganic materials for your plant-based garden at learnveganic.com. Over the past 30 plus years, many of us have learned how powerful we actually have been as consumers in asking for vegan and plant-based items, and certainly for organic produce. And no, it wasn't overnight. But that's why there's really no time to waste, right? To ask and to learn a little bit more about these issues at the upcoming free Veganic Summit. Maybe make a plan right now for at least some of those fall leaves that are probably heading your way this month. And in the meantime, please remember to veg your best. Veg Your Best podcast production, music, and editing by Charlie Weinshank. Thanks, Charlie. Before you go, it would mean so much to me and the Veg Your Best team if you would hit subscribe, leave us a 5-star review, or share with someone you think might be interested. Something about algorithms, it helps bump us up a little in the rankings, and that's the best way to help others find the podcast and for us to find our audience. So, until next week, make it easy and veg your best.